Hello, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Elliott. I'm a lecturer in the English department where I specialise in medieval and Renaissance literature and its reception. And I also convene our Level 5 course, Writing the Self, which forms the subject of today's lecture. The subject of this lecture, Writing the Self, seems to be a simple one at first glance. Writing about the self is one of the first kinds of writing that many children are asked to do in writing about what they did at the weekend or on holidays. Despite its apparent simplicity, however, the relationship between writing and the self raises questions about the nature of the self and what it means to write about the self. These questions are anything but simple. The issues at stake become clearer if we look at the idea of autobiography, which for many people is synonymous with life writing. The term is a coinage from Greek, linking the words for self, autos, life, bios, and graphy, writing. Although it sounds like it belongs to the classical world, however, autobiography is a relatively recent term, and autobiography as a concept reflects its particular origins in the 18th century. The politics of autobiography emerge in attempts to define the term. And this is the first slide, please, Jacinta. In the 70s, Karl Weintraub argues that autobiography is a form of expression best suited to reveal the developing self-conceptions of Western man. For Weintraub, autobiography serves to establish the pattern and meaning of a life, and is characterized by a value placed on individuality, rejecting scripts and models for selfhood. More recent work in the field recognises the historical and cultural specificity of the idea of autobiography, as Weintraub's emphasis on individuality, significance, and masculine self-determination suggest. The traditional conception of autobiography mirrors the great man theory of history. As the 19th century Scottish author Thomas Carlyle put it, the idea that the history of the world is but the biography of great men. In contrast, use of terms such as life writing or self-writing respond to the exclusionary nature of the traditional conception of autobiography. Life writing seeks to recognise the diversity of ways of being, of other possibilities for subjectivity, and other possible relationships that might exist between writing and the self. Rather than treating the self as a universal, recent work in life writing historicises the subject. Here the self is to be located in time and in its relationship to the particular environment in which it emerges. One area of research I'd like to highlight in this lecture draws on work in philosophy of mind and cognitive science, offering evidence that cognition is not confined to the processes that take place within the brain, inside the skull and under the surface of the skin. Cognition is a process that can extend across the material and social world as part of a dynamic engagement with our environment. Theories of distributed cognition or extended mind argue that the self can be understood as the product of how we, as embodied subjects, interact with our world. As Richard Heersmink argues, human selves are open as to incorporate objects and artifacts in our autobiographical memories and narrative selves, and importantly, it is not just objects, but also other people who are incorporated into ourselves. As an illustration of Heersmink's argument, we might think about how memory can be shared between a group of friends or between romantic partners. This is what researchers term socially distributed or transactive memory. Members of a group can cue each other to remember details of a shared experience, such as the name of a film that they saw together, or who was there when a particular thing happened. Although individual members of the group may be unable to remember particular details, collectively they can build a memory that exceeds the sum of its individual parts. Objects can scaffold our memories too. The cup that you brought back from a trip abroad, the necklace that a friend gave to you, a photograph. The loss of evocative objects like these can diminish us and cause us psychological pain. Approaching our sense of self as the product of a dynamic process of interaction with objects and people in our social and material environment allows us to consider the role of historically specific technologies in scaffolding ourselves. The genre of autobiography, as described in the earlier part of this lecture, is one such technology. It's a technology that contributes to the reproduction and reinforcement of a particular model of the individualist self. Research in cognitive science and psychology points towards a mutually constitutive relationship between culture and the self, and to the role that patterns in the everyday practices that shape our lives play in fostering a particular sense of self. Societies where individualistic practices, such as living in smaller familial groupings, predominate, foster an individualistic conception of self, as opposed to societies where the structures of everyday life accentuate the reciprocal and collective. The conception of autobiography, as Weintraub defines it, in terms of a selfhood that rejects scripts and models, reflects the individualist tendency of the global north since the 18th century. In contrast, medieval and early modern cultures favoured forms of self-construction that emphasise connection, not distinction. Writing about yourself might even be considered bad taste, as the poet Dante Alighieri argues. The rhetoricians forbid anyone to speak of themselves except through necessity, and the reason for this restriction is that one cannot avoid praising or criticising the person about whom one speaks, and such things are coarse when spoken of self. Rather than emphasising their own originality, medieval writers tended to highlight the connection between their own work and tradition, training their memory so that they could build up a treasury of texts stored in the minds. The trained memory was understood as the foundation of ethics. In training their memories, medieval scholars shaped themselves. As paper became more widespread and affordable in the early modern era, and more people had access to the education and training that people needed to write, a material counterpart to the practice of gathering and storing a treasury of valuable texts in the memory began to emerge. This is the practice known as commonplacing, or the making of commonplace books. Next slide, please. On this slide, you can see a couple of 17th century examples of commonplace books. And the contents of books like these ones can be very diverse. On the left-hand side of the screen, for example, you can see a list of the books which my daughter Elizabeth hath read unto me at nights till she read them all out. In books like these, you might find recipes or accounts, or the name of a friend added in their own handwriting during a visit. These books might function as evocative objects in various ways. One of their key functions, however, was as a place to gather up fragments of poems and aphorisms, pieces of texts. The processes of gathering, arranging, and assimilating these fragments of texts was fundamental to the way that humanists interacted with classical sources. Commonplace books offered a systematic technology for managing established cultural codes. As Mary Thomas Crane argues, the commonplace book provided an influential model for authorial practice and for authoritative self-fashioning. In making their commonplace books, humanist scholars defined themselves. In his work on practices of life writing in early modern England, Adam Smythe draws attention to the contrast between the models of selfhood embodied in commonplace books and what modern conceptions of autobiography have taught us to expect. And this is the next slide, please. Smythe argues, commonplace books can shed some light on alternative early modern conceptions of subjectivity. If criticism conditions us to expect a subjectivity founded on difference and individuality, commonplace books suggest subjectivity that proceeds through a searching out of analogues, which prizes sameness, not difference. A sameness that extends from past through present to future lives. Experience here is valuable not because it's unique and singular, but because it repeats a prior model, a model that's acknowledged to be important. Medieval writing about personal experience reflects a similar tendency. Most prominently, in spiritual writings such as the lives of saints, the experience of the saint was often framed as being a repetition of Christ's suffering and Christ's life. Secular life narratives did something similar. In the 15th century Scottish poem, The King Esquire, or The King's Book, King James I of Scotland reads Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, a hugely influential philosophical text throughout the Middle Ages that focuses on Boethius's experience of imprisonment. James, like many other statesmen across medieval Europe, uses Boethius as a model to reimagine his own experience of exile and imprisonment in England. As well as the Commonplace book, early modern England had another technology people used to scaffold a sense of self. And this is the next slide, please. This technology is the account book. And you can see one example of an account book on the slide. As well as in the 16th century saw a proliferation of diaries and other kinds of life narrative, in part driven by the emphasis that Protestant religious practice placed on proper accounting for time, and the need to spend time in socially sanctioned ways, such as labour or prayer. Many early diaries offer simple lists of what someone did during their day, with none of the emotional reflection that we might expect to find in life writing. Financial accounts offered a model that early modern people might use to account for time. The regular order of the account book and the ideas of balance, clarity, and truthfulness associated with practices of financial accounting, at least idealized practices of financial accounting, these shaped the idea of what diaries and other forms of life narrative were setting out to achieve. As a basis for the diary, the technology of accounting served as a medium that people used to construct and reconstruct the narratives of their own experience, scaffolding the narrative self. With these examples of how the idea of the self has been mediated by material objects and technologies at different points in time, we might turn back to consider how the technologies of the present work to scaffold ourselves now. How ourselves are interwoven with the objects and people that we interact with, and built into the structures of our everyday lives. If we recognise how sameness, as well as difference and distinction, work to develop and build our conceptions of ourselves, many aspects of everyday life can be understood as part of how we write ourselves. And this is the last slide, please. We might consider the role of present-day social media platforms, such as Twitter or Tumblr, and the way that these platforms facilitate the reproduction of other people's content through practices such as reblogging, as the counterparts of early modern commonplacing, and the arrangement of fragments of texts gathered from the materials of culture that took place in commonplace books. If, as many Twitter biographies claim, retweets are not endorsements, we can see the practices of gathering and reproducing other people's words as part of how people now intervene in the cultural codes of our time and take ownership of them. We can understand ourselves as something that we build through the tools that we use, woven into the material and social worlds that we inhabit. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Liz. We don't currently have any questions in the chat. However, we'll give people a short moment just in case they have any questions that they might want to ask you. I think it's probably worth noting as well, just while we're waiting to see if anybody has any questions, all the little lectures are being recorded and they will be available on the Little Lectures webpage and the University of Aberdeen YouTube channel. So if you're interested in listening back to this little lecture or any of the others that have been occurring over the past few months, they will be available there as well.
Thank you very much to everybody for coming along. This is very much the starting point for the Level 5 course, Writing the Self, which those of you who join us for either the English Language and Literature AMLIT or the new Literatures, Environments and Places AMLIT, both of which are beginning in September, or the current Master's course in English Literature that we offer, you'll be able to undertake this course if if the lecture today has appealed to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Liz. And thank you everyone for attending. Enjoy the rest of your day.